Hello, I'm Sarah Sheen, co-president of the Defined Contribution Real Estate Council. I'd like to welcome you all to today's webinar on the inclusion of alternative investments in DC plans, hosted jointly by DCREC, DCALTA, DCIIA, and PREA. Our goal is to continue to collaborate to provide valuable content to key stakeholders such as yourselves. To that end, you'll find resources provided by the sponsors of today's webinar on the left navigation bar. Click on the button called Resources to find thought leadership pertinent to today's discussion. Please note, this event is being recorded. The views presented are those of the speakers and not those of their company affiliations. Thank you for attending, and we also greatly appreciate the participation of our speakers. With that, I'll turn it over to our moderator, Chris Nikolic of AllianceBernstein.
Thanks, Sarah, and I'd like to also thank our sponsors today. In my role, I've utilized and seen the benefits of incorporating alternatives into DC plans and other multi-asset class portfolios. But if I do a good job today, you'll hear very little from me because I'm really here to facilitate a discussion and the sharing of insights from 3 plan sponsors who have all incorporated or are going through the process of considering incorporating alternatives into their DC plan. First is Brad Creel from Lockheed, manages a $3 billion real estate portfolio. He also oversees the investments, the real estate investments in their DC plan, and was part of a committee recently tasked to provide more innovative options to participants. So thanks for joining, Brad. Dan Larson is a senior portfolio manager with the Utah Retirement Systems. Dan manages various real estate portfolios for their DB plan and also oversees the private real estate investments on their DC plan. And finally, last but not least, Marco Mertz is the head of DC for the University of California. He's responsible for the plan design, investment strategy, and execution of the CIO's business plan. And he oversees $34 billion in 403B and 457 and DC assets. So with that, maybe Brad, I'll start with you as we think about the case for alternatives. Why should we include alternatives such as private real estate and private equity? Maybe start with some of the investment rationale.
Well, primarily we were after high risk adjusted returns with low correlations to the other asset classes. We also needed, as part of an assessment of our existing DC plan and our ability to recruit new talent, we needed to modernize our options, and this meant recognizing that our target date funds were drastically underutilized compared to our peers, and we really had too many options, and we just wanted to get everything more streamlined and cleaned up, cut the non-performers and anything that was underutilized. And in this process, we said, well, we really need to simplify. We need to innovate where we can. And ultimately, we need to improve our retirees' outcome, or the retirement outcomes for our plan participants. And here's a great opportunity as well, where we can leverage our size and our existing opportunities. So this was what got us started down the path. And we have now completed this enrollment, and thankfully, our target objectives as far as greater TDF participation have been met. And time will tell as far as what we went after primarily, which is the high risk adjusted returns. If that will pan out, but we certainly have the diversification benefits.
Great, thanks, Brad. And maybe one quick follow up is there anything about the current market environment that maybe makes the case for adding alternatives particularly appealing today?
Well, the smoothing of returns certainly, and the I look at especially in my world of real estate is that real estate houses the economy, but the new economy and the economy is changing rapidly, and this is through these avenues is where we will capture such change and benefit from it.
Great, thanks, Brad. Maybe Dan, I'll turn to you next, and just ask you what are we seeing in terms of trends and the regulatory environment, and can you provide some context as to what's been happening at Utah that helped shape your overall case for incorporating alternatives?
Certainly. We in the state of Utah, about 10 years ago, our state legislature, coming out of the last financial crisis, had a bit of a discussion as to what's an appropriate burden for the taxpayers, and really discussed about pension reform, something that I think a lot of my peers and other funds are going to be doing if they haven't already. And they made the decision to essentially create a hybrid system for state employees, which is you can still have your defined benefit plan if you want one, but also you can be a defined contribution employee as well. And so by making that decision and shifting that risk off of the taxpayers and putting it back onto the employees themselves through the defined contribution plan, they found that that would be a good option for some, and some would actually end up choosing that. And we've been in that scenario for the last 10 years. As such, our defined contribution plan has gotten quite big over that time, much larger than it was. And as we were evaluating what this change would mean for the benefit of the employees, we looked at historical returns. We'd had defined contribution plans for a while, defined benefit plan for a while, and just noticed that the defined benefit plan outperformed the defined contribution plan for a variety of reasons. And we tried to identify what those things were and try to just make it so that the defined contribution plan and the defined benefit plan, whether an employee chooses one or the other, they're not necessarily benefited or hurt just based on the selection of the plan that they're in. So at that time, we switched to more of the target date fund structure and really tried to de-emphasize so much of the equities and fixed income investments that defined contribution really has and the liquidity components that they need to be designed for, and try to really create a proxy for bringing more alternatives in and giving them some of the things that Brad had mentioned as far as diversification and just a better risk-adjusted return. So that was really the rationale for why we did it and why we're continually looking for ways to improve it. You had mentioned the regulatory environment. There's a couple of other challenges. I feel like private real estate's a little bit ahead of the curve as far as putting certain assets and alternatives into the defined contribution plan, but we're definitely learning with the things that we've done with the private real estate, and at some point in the future hope to get more and more of our defined benefit assets into our defined contribution plans.
Great, thanks, Dan. So it sounds like you were doing this analysis, and the ultimate conclusion was the DC plan was lacking from a return or a risk-adjusted return perspective, without alternatives compared to what you had in the defined benefit plan.
Yeah, it did. And there are other structural reasons why that is for it. But we did find that, it would the correlations were better to just not have everything be dipping and going up at the same time as you would to smooth things out. And just get more alternatives in there to just kind of smooth things out.
Great. Thank you. And one of the things I've seen from the regulatory environment, I think the letter from the DOL last year, specifically regarding private equity, but I think, used by some as a proxy for all investments, really increased the focus, and I think gave investors a roadmap to follow as they consider adding alternatives to their DC plans. And as we think about that case for alternatives, Marco, maybe I'll turn to you. Is there anything you could share about are there issues of fairness between different cohorts of participants as you think about the case for alternatives?
Yeah, I think, Chris, that's to us from a philosophical perspective precisely the point why we believe alternatives should be invested. Dan alluded to that, right? I'm a participant of the DB plan. I'm a participant of our DC plan. For me, Marco, as the participant of the DB plan, implicitly, it's important, good that I have alternative assets. But once I switch my hat to the DC side, all of a sudden there's all these reasons, challenges, and obstacles why it's not a good idea to hold those assets. So there's just simply a philosophical disconnect. risk-adjusted returns obviously are the main reason, but I think going forward, that's a nuance at least that we're concerned about, is that when we talk to our GPs, one story, one comment we hear increasingly, and that is private for longer. So assets are not exited through an IPO or putting those assets public anymore. And if that's indeed the case, that wealth accumulation increasingly will happen on the private side before they go public, that of course is even more of a problem for DC plans, as you see an even more widening difference between expected returns on the private and the public side. So I think that nuance around private for longer is going to be a real challenge down the road. And we as plan sponsors have to solve that. And quite frankly, really need to remember that philosophical disconnect, that our participant base is identical. It's the same, Marco, on the DB side as well as the DC side. It's just an implicit versus an explicit ownership. But I think that's fundamentally why we believe it's so important to incorporate alternative assets, and especially important as we go forward. If you look at virtually every plan in the country, it's true for us as well, we're all increasing our strategic asset allocation to privates on the DB side, right? So that disconnect we just need to fix. And that's, for us, fundamentally why we believe alternatives should be in the DC plan.
Great, thanks, Marco. And you mentioned private for longer, as we're seeing with some corporations, it may be private forever. And they just don't need to do that IPO. They don't need to access public markets for their funding needs. We can debate and discuss the case for alternatives. And I think all of you have identified some compelling reasons why alternatives should be added to DC plans. But in my opinion, that's not the key question plan sponsors are asking. I've had CIOs say to me, you don't need to sell me on the benefits of incorporating alternatives. I get it. But the key questions are, how do you do it? How do you make it happen? And maybe, Marco, I'll come back to you first on this one. Can you describe within the University of California the process or the roadmap as you go down a project such as incorporating alternatives? Who needs to be involved both internally and externally as you embark on a project such as this?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just going to share a little bit of inside baseball, and this is probably unique to the University of California. As you can imagine, we have a very broad base of stakeholders, actual stakeholders, or even just perceived stakeholders that believe they need to know and opine on changes in the DC plan. But for us, it was, of course, started with the Office of the CIO. We have our academic senate, so that's the representation for faculty that we needed to get on board, which was relatively straightforward. Obviously, I think the biggest hurdles were our HR staff and our legal staff, quite frankly. So having those two portions, those two stakeholders on board, helping them understand, and really getting over the hurdles. What I often feel on the plan sponsor side are reasons that are put up to say we can't do this or we don't want to do this, which usually always are, well, there's fiduciary risk, the fees are high, and valuation and liquidity are a problem, and that's why we shouldn't be doing it, right? So I think working through those challenges and helping people understand that each of them can be overcome, and you start very early and engage your stakeholders from the get-go of a project was critical for us, right? Getting your stakeholders involved early rather than telling them, this is what we worked on, this is the strategy, now just, in the case of HR, now just communicate this for me. That's not going to be successful. It's not going to get you where you want to be. So I think that's one takeaway for us. That's not unique, obviously, the incorporation to alternatives. That's true for every change of the DC plan. Get your stakeholders involved early, make them part of the team that thinks about this, and as you incorporate changes, in particular, also in alternatives. So I think that communication aspect is critical from my perspective.
Great, thanks, Marco. And maybe a follow-up, as you've talked about the stakeholders, and maybe you focused a little bit more on the ones internal to the University of California. How do you think about external parties that need to be a part of that process as well? How can they help? Who do you need to leverage?
Yeah, I think, Chris, and this, of course, from us being a little bit of a larger DC plan, I think engaging external partners, I think, is going to largely depend on how many resources do you have internally. If you have a dedicated private real estate team, as we do, I think it's going to be easier to not heavily rely on outside help. We, for example, don't use a consultant to help us think through this because I have the internal expertise. I think if you go down the spectrum of size, I think that there, of course, it's going to be critically important that you start thinking about an outside consultant. I think that nuance between larger and smaller plan also will factor in how you actually incorporate private real estate, right? We have a fully diversified private real estate, private equity portfolio. Our plan is to unitize those assets and actually hold a fully diversified, fully seasoned vintage diversified portfolio that we simply port from the DB plan to the DC plan. That's a luxury, Dan and Brad and we have, because we have those internal resources and those internal portfolios. That's going to be different for a smaller plan. And quite frankly, this is something that the three of us sometimes need to appreciate. The luxury of having that internal firepower, if you will, is not the case for many of our DC plans. But I think Chris, I think that's really going to be dependent on the individual plan sponsor.
Thanks, Marco. Maybe Dan, turning back to you, what were some of the key considerations within Utah and that you helped solve as you thought about incorporating alternatives in the DB plan, in the DC plan, excuse me, and maybe if you could share, what were some of the actual obstacles versus maybe what you or others perceived going into this process?
Certainly. So, we kind of looked at this when our state legislature was discussing this and debating this, and it looked like it was probably going to happen with the hybrid approach to our plans. We knew that was probably going to happen. And then we also knew that we were just on the defined contribution side, they wanted to switch to the target date funds. So they went live with the hybridization of our plans in 2011. And then they had kind of set a date of 2015 is when we wanted to switch to target date funds. So we had a few years really to prepare for that. As we kind of targeted if we're going to make the change from, REITs, which was the real estate exposure in the defined contribution plan to the private real estate. So we had to go through a number of hoops from just the thought phase to how can we actually pull this off? Is this something that we should do? And then just kind of bringing the two groups together. We kind of have two different groups. You have the defined contribution team and then the defined benefit team. And the defined contribution team, I would say they are really experts on the structure and the administrative side. And on the defined benefit plan side, we're probably more on the experts of, is this a good plan? Is this a good manager? These real estate, is the good proxy real estate for what we're investing in. So we kind of had to bring the two together to kind of marry them, but then also look at what really mattered mostly to the defined contribution team as well as the defined benefit team. Obviously, things like daily valuation are a reality that we don't have to deal with on the defined benefit team. And liquidity, we don't let our participants pull out of the defined benefit plan. And so how to get educated ourselves, first and foremost, on what's important to them. But then also, I would say, let them know what's important to us. They obviously have a consultant that really focuses more on the administrative side. We have a consultant that really helps us more on what good investments are. And so we did need to get sign off from them, but we also met with many, many, many managers and the same managers multiple times just to make sure that all the defined contribution questions were getting answered and all the defined benefit questions were getting answered. And what are the implications of getting something that's good that we see on the defined benefit side and the trade-off on the defined contribution world. So it was a lot of, I don't want to say brain damage, but it was a lot of brainstorming. It was a lot of meetings. It was a lot of getting together and collaborating and trying to figure out what really mattered and what didn't. I'd say at the end of the day, you know, as Marco mentioned, we had our legal and our compliance and our administration involved in things. You know, huge concerns about liquidity. We were just coming out of a financial crisis, so we wanted to make sure we had appropriate guardrails up to make sure that things were protected if we went through another downturn like that. But also, you know, just the daily valuation things and liquidity. We found that when we were first starting, the only option we had was 75% private real estate, 25% REITs or REIT sleeve. Then whether we wanted active management or passive management, you know, things just kind of melted away as concerns were getting resolved. We ultimately concluded that we didn't need as much exposure to the private side of REITs. We didn't need to have as much of liquidity as the plans at the time offered. So we went with a 15 and an 85, just figuring that we can manage the ranges internally. We don't need to have somebody manage that for us. And, you know, my understanding now is that there's probably options that are 0% REITs and 100% private real estate. Again, I think the space is evolving over time, and that's just something that I think is more and more investors step up to the plate and invest money. We truly find as a group what's important and what isn't.
Thanks, Dan. Those comments were really helpful. And I think some of the most interesting are on some of those organizational aspects. And in some cases, you see maybe Treasury and HR, if we refer them broadly to the investments and the non-investment side of not necessarily working closely together, but what you're describing is almost two elements of investment focused. Maybe one is a little more implementation with the DB managers and DC. And, you know, as part of this process are the quote unquote DB and DC cohorts or groups within Utah. Are they continuing to work more closely together because of this maybe partnership that was developed by incorporating privates into the DC plan?
I'd say yeah, and I'd say a lot of the learning that we've taken from the real estate side, we're, you know, applying some of that thinking towards some of the other alternatives and how could you bring those in, because they, you know, aren't nearly as far as long as private real estate is. But yeah, it was good to have forged those relationships, to forge that communication internally, and to be able to work on both sides and not just be so siloed.
Great, thanks. Brad, I'll turn things to you. Curious if you have anything to add on actual versus perceived obstacles. If you could talk a little bit about lessons learned, and if anyone's seen me play golf, they know I'm not a golfer. But maybe Brad, if you had a mulligan, what if anything would you do differently if you went through this process again?
Well, we were very fortunate in that, with all the different parties involved, from our internal DB side investment committee to the corporate side, the CFO, the treasury functions, that they were, you know, all on board, and that our CIO. So this is, I think it's very important to make all the parties involved understand that there's going to be an enormous amount of man hours here to identify any red flags early as to what is going to be between us now and the end game, and to always remind them, you know, no matter how many pop up, this is orders that are straight from the top, that there's nothing that's stopping this train, right? We're doing this, and you know, kind of get on board. And so the enormity that it also, I think we overlooked how, at the end of the day, how necessary the internal communications team is, and that no one can get overlooked, or you could get into some, you know, office politics or what have you. And I think whereas the legal department knew from the onset how much work this was going to be, when you got involved with all the different third parties that had to be worked with and brought in, and then at the you know, sort of the right before the blackout period, and the working with the transition manager, and how many things that popped up that really have some tight timelines. I think they, you know, if we had to do it again, it would almost be to add some resources there on team legal ahead of this, just for some of the grunt work.
Thanks, Brad. Maybe let's move this one level deeper as we try and give plan sponsors a roadmap or a playbook onto how all of you address the issues or might address them in the future as they come up. And maybe I'll turn back to you, Marco. As you think about the risks and the benefits of adding alts to DC, there are often questions raised about fees. Well, won't fees be higher? And questions raised about litigation risk. And how do you and how does the University of California think about both of those as you move away from maybe the traditional path and consider the incorporation of alternatives?
I'll start with fiduciary risk, and I think probably our legal team would get a heart attack if they hear me saying that. But in our view, it is we're going to get sued at the end of the day for something anyway, either for doing something or for not doing something. So you might as well take on fiduciary risk for something that you fundamentally believe will improve participant outcomes. So I'm not suggesting that there's no fiduciary risk by incorporating alternative assets, but at the end of the day, I think that's kind of the mind shift that we all as plan sponsors really need to do and ask ourselves, is it worth taking on that fiduciary risk? And if it unequivocally clear is it is worth, and Chris, I think your comment around we don't need to talk about really the case for why to incorporate it, right? If everybody agrees that's what you should be doing, then why wouldn't you take on some fiduciary risk and basically say, okay, yes, there may be some fiduciary risk, but I'm taking it on for the right reason. And that's kind of the argumentation that is happening internally with us is, yes, there's going to be some fiduciary risk, but it's worth taking. The other thing that I would say is obviously it depends on where you think about incorporating privates. If it's on a standalone side, I think the fiduciary risk is probably a little bit higher than it is under the hood of the target date fund. So my point around this on the roadmap is, and that's what we will do, is we're going to incorporate private equity in the target date fund, not as a standalone option. So I also think it depends largely on where you're going to actually incorporate your alternatives. I think all those things, fiduciary risk, liquidities, fees, become much more muted when you actually incorporate it in the target date fund. Fees is a big one, and I think I will acknowledge we all probably are a little bit guilty of our own success, because for years we've talked about how we're able to reduce fees and cut costs and cut administrative charges. So there also needs to be a little bit of a re-education of our board, and that's partially on me, that you should not think about fees in isolation, but very much think about what is improving outcomes for participants. And if at the end of the day, I'm paying a little bit more, this goes back to the reason why you should be doing this. If you end up paying a little bit more for better expected returns and ultimately better outcomes, then again, you should be taking on higher fees. So I think there is a re-education that's needed. And I think that's the first step, is when you go to board meetings and you talk about your fees and how low they are, you should continuously, even before you go to your board around incorporating alternatives, you should start changing your own narrative around why fees are important, but they need to be viewed in context. So I think laying the groundwork early, again, this goes back to get your stakeholders involved early. You need to start changing the narrative immediately, even though you might not be incorporating alternatives in the immediate future, to make sure that down the road, when you're going to go to your board and say, I want to include private equity, it costs substantially more, but just do it, then there is actually already that muscle memory, hopefully, of your investment committee or your governing board that will say, yes, Marco talked about this for 2 years. Fees are low, we reduced fees, but fees cannot be viewed in isolation. So I think this laying down crumbs on the way is going to be really important.
Yeah, that's a great point, Marco. And I think there's a natural catalyst to begin to think about and do that today, going back to what Brad was mentioning earlier in terms of the market environment. And maybe some have argued, well, if equities go up 10% every year and bonds return 5%, and bonds do a great job offsetting equity risk, well, you don't necessarily need alternatives. But that's not the market environment that most people expect that we're in today. And as a result, to your point, Marco, there has to be a focus on fees, but also a consideration of value for money, and what are we going to be able to deliver in the future?
And I think at least that's my strategy, is you can implicitly do that. Dan made this point, we all made the point, right, that the DB plan is outperforming the DC plan and private equity is outperforming public equity. If you start having that conversation with your governing board, that take a look at the DB plan and how expected returns and actual returns have improved, and look at the DC plan, right? If you don't start with fees, but show the merit and why we're doing that on the DB side, rather than talk about fees first, I think that's also going to help. So changing that narrative, if you have the luxury of having a DB plan that has private equity exposure and don't have it in the DC plan, bringing this up to the board and explaining this and highlighting it, hopefully at some point they will tell you, well, why are you not doing it on the DC side, rather than you telling them we have to do it. I think there's some messaging early on that you can do that will make it easier down the road if you actually propose private equity, because they will say, yes, absolutely, I get it. We do it on the DP plan, we pay more because it ultimately improves outcomes. So I think that's another tactic. I think if you have a DB plan and a DC plan, start that conversation early, highlight the differences early, and hopefully they actually, at some points, come to you and say, well, why haven't you thought about this? And then you can say, well, actually we did.
Great. Dan, back to you. You mentioned some of the differences between a DB plan and DC in terms of the need for liquidity, for example, daily valuation, and how did you think about that? How did you think about the striking of NAVs for a DC participant on less liquid assets, any sort of issues relating to stale pricing? And I'd also like to go back to something you mentioned earlier. You mentioned the maybe shrinking public real estate allocations in some of the products, and you were comfortable with a higher exposure to privates. And you mentioned you could manage the liquidity. Maybe if you could expand on that and share how that liquidity is managed both inside products as well as outside of it.
Certainly. Yeah, there's a lot there to unpack, but I'll try to hit all those points. As it relates to when we initially started, this was new, right? The daily, how do you daily value private real estate? And then you'd go and talk to the managers. Manager A has a process, manager B has a process, manager C has a process. Then you dive in deep. My boss is an MAI appraiser, he currently is an MAI appraiser. So he was very, concerned about how do appraisers really value these things and what's the appropriate way to do that and strike a value. When we dove in and spent the time investigating it and trying to address everybody's concerns, we kind of found that on the margins, they're all very, very similar, and they're all defendable, and they're all, they've been approved by a third party. They've back tested them. And so when it comes to daily valuation, it was important to us that they had a daily valuation process, and it was something that was defendable and I won't say provable, but defendable, and been evaluated by other parties. That I think daily valuation didn't end up becoming the issue that we initially thought it was, as we went in further and further. Kind of the same thing with liquidity. Obviously, coming out of the financial crisis, we were very concerned about our own personal needs for taking money out and rebalancing. Also, we had learned counterparty risk, fellow investors. What happens if there's a run on the bank and everybody's trying to get out, and how do the funds get locked up, and all those kind of I'd say more the minutia of how it's constructed. We spent a lot of time kind of talking about scenarios and how that would all work. And at the end of the day, I think, we didn't go all in on this thesis. We just felt like, the liquidity and our liquidity is kind of our problem, and not necessarily our the funds problem or our counterparty's problem so much, in that we can manage it through our own targets and our own ranges that we have. I guess what really took us to that point is when we were kind of seeing the back testing of all the liquidity and what had happened. We had noticed that some investors want to be coming in and out every single day. And if they're doing that, they need a lot more private real estate or public real estate to facilitate that liquidity of just daily transactions. And I don't want to say that subsidizes might not be the right word, but if you think of putting private real estate into the defined contribution plans as providing a better risk-adjusted return, the fact that we have more equities than we would want would effectively be subsidizing those that need that liquidity. And we didn't really want that enhanced liquidity. We didn't need to have 25%. So we kind of felt like, okay, we would rather be put in a plan where we're with other investors that aren't needing to just come in and out every single day with just tiny little dollar amounts. We can just do that when we need to and rebalance when we need to, which is less frequently. So that's kind of where we got on the liquidity side. We, like I said, we didn't go all in. We still kept a little tiny bit of a private or a public REIT sleeve that was side by side with the private. We put that in there for a number of years and just kind of evaluated what was the liquidity needs over an X amount of time, and then ultimately concluded that we would re-up and increase our private real estate exposure in the defined contribution plan, and that we didn't necessarily need that safety. Obviously, something could happen tomorrow, and what I'm saying would be proven wrong. Black swans happen all the time, but we're just looking at it and how to manage it on a day-to-day basis to the best we possibly can, knowing that things could happen. And we would just maybe figure out those situations and not be outsourcing that to the manager themselves to manage it for us, because it's going to come at a cost. And to us, that cost is not having as good of risk-adjusted returns.
Yep.
And then you had mentioned another part of that question. I kind of forgot what that was.
I think you covered the main points on liquidity, on how you think about the evolution from maybe a 75-25 to an 85-15. And I think you made a really important point of there's a couple of levels that liquidity can be managed within a vehicle. It can be managed outside of the vehicle. And I think those, the evidence that we have historically of people's liquidity needs, whether it be in 2008 or last year during COVID, it's important to go through that process that you did and really stress test those assumptions to get comfortable. So thanks, Dan.
And it was those liquidity fears for us that I think led us ultimately to have an option in real estate, but not have an option in PE yet. When we looked at the plumbing and how the daily value funds worked, we felt that some of the real estate offerings were well ahead. We don't want to see, we don't want to see a high REIT component either. Couldn't agree more with Dan. We don't want to subsidize somebody else's need to, bounce in and out of these vehicles on a daily basis. But we understood the need, or for the plumbing to work. It's a bit of a necessary evil to have, exposure to the REITs. The foundation of why we wanted private real estate to begin with was we felt like the public REITs that were already there were just more equities, and so this step in the evolution, I think we're going to see kind of next is the more and more offerings on the other side that have this plumbing figured out and that we can then go into. I think Marco and his team should be applauded for their attempts or for the path they're going down on the unitization and the port in what they already have and the expertise that built it. For us, we felt I guess for fears of litigation risk, or perhaps it was the easier path to as going through the re-enrollment. But I think the next step for our group and all these groups is this unitization.
Great, thanks, Brad. And I think we'll continue to see that evolution where we're seeing more and more plans go down the path that you just highlighted that Marco had alluded to in terms of unitizing a DB plan. There's more record keepers and other entities in terms of the custodians that are familiar with this process, and we'll be able to leverage all of that success that others are going through.
Yeah, and I think, Chris, the only thing that I would add is that obviously the traditional players, record keeper, custodians, consultants are thinking about this, but there's good innovation also around how do you value these on a daily basis. We work with a smaller company called FEV that actually is doing some very good research around how can you strike daily NAVs for private equity, for example. So I think the innovation in the processes of daily valuing, there is actually some real work and good work that's being done. So I think, especially on the private equity side, Brad and Dan, of course, are absolutely right. I mean, the real estate space is much farther ahead than private equity, but there's real good innovation around thinking about how you can do this even on a daily basis. So to us, valuation, again, is highly dependent on where, and I'm repeating myself, but highly dependent on where it is. If you look at the superannuation funds in Australia, for example, some of them, they say, why do you even care about daily valuation if it's under the target date fund? It's a 10% allocation. Let's just carry this at the stale NAV, and ultimately, just whenever I get my GP cap by statements on a quarterly basis, we readjust it. So obviously, we're going to get a heart attack around litigation risk, but there are others that simply say, as long as this is not a standalone option, is it part of a diversified portfolio? Why do you worry so much about daily valuation? So I think that's of course probably the other end of the spectrum where some investors are completely comfortable with saying, as long as it's a modest percentage of an overall portfolio, why do you even worry about daily valuation? Let's just carry that piece at a stale NAV.
Yep, I think you're right. I think maybe we all wish we could put that daily valuation genie back in the bottle, and just because it's unlikely for that to happen, that doesn't mean that we can't have daily liquidity and daily valuation for the participant, but there may be some segments of the portfolio that are for example, priced on a less frequent basis. And Marco, maybe I'll stay with you a little bit. You mentioned communications earlier. I think there's really two reasons that we think about communicating to participants. One is there are legal requirements. The other is providing information to participants that they need to make informed choices. And how do you think about that? And maybe how do you think about it differently if, as you mentioned earlier, the alternatives are offered on a standalone basis, or if they're offered part of a multi-asset class portfolio, such as a target date fund? And I'm going to have you pause for a second before you answer that. And just I'll remind the audience on the comments section, you can ask questions through the chat. So we're having a great conversation. I don't know if we'll get to many of them, but please fire away with your questions. We'll address as many as we can. But back to you, Marco.
Yeah, I think I'll make a couple of comments, and both Dan and Brad alluded to this. We, of course, sit on the investment side. Right? We're part of the CIO team. We talk about investing, PE, GPs. We use the going jargon of investing. And so what we realized that it's critically important to have somebody that is able to translate that industry jargon that we use and almost assume everybody will understand for our participants. We have 300,000 individuals. They're not investment professionals. We have janitors at our healthcare facilities, at our medical centers. I can't expect them to understand what we're talking about. And so with anything that we do, that partnership, Chris, that you alluded to between HR and us, our team is not responsible, or it's not our purview to actually create collateral and content and education. That's on the HR side. So one of the first things that we did is have an ongoing bond between those two teams. That's not unique to alternatives, but I think having an ongoing connectivity to that is critically important. And we actually hired, this is not on the private side, but we actually got help when we incorporated guaranteed income recently. It's an annuity, also illiquid, also foreign with perceived negative connotations, we actually got outside help to translate some of those more complex parts down to easy, digestible, and understandable bites. And so I think that's going to be really important, is to remember that the way we talk about privates is not going to be the way it's digested. And then I think you're absolutely right, Chris. My view on incorporated in the target date fund, I almost don't think that needs to be hugely discussed and broadly explained, because the overarching wrapper is not going to change. It's just an additional asset class. You don't necessarily communicate if you're moving from a active manager A to active manager B either. So I think communication will really be important more on the standalone side than it is on the target date fund side. But there, critically important is getting help from somebody that is able to digest and really translate the industry talk that we are so used to really understandable participant content.
Yeah, I agree, Marco. I think we tend to use a lot of jargon, and the more we can put it in terms that are just simply easily understood by participants, that will help us all. You know, I've heard sometime maybe as a communications argument against the inclusion of alternatives that the participants aren't going to understand that segment of the portfolio. How are you going to effectively communicate them? And you know, if that's the bar, I think that every participant would understand everything that we're doing, we'd be left with nothing. So I think we've got to have information there that is clear and concise. We want to have more information for those that want to go somewhere and get some additional color. But the average participant isn't going to be as informed as us and everyone on this call. And I think we've got to accept that.
Yeah, and Chris, I think, and this goes to ultimately the challenge I think is going to be, is if you're adding private real estate or private equity to your core lineup, and then you're trying to explain to your participants why that is a good exposure they should be having, the uptake is going to be negligible. You're not going to get private equity and private real estate in their portfolio. That's true for almost any new exposure, new fund that you add to a DC lineup. So that's the other thing that I would think about. Are you really going to get significant assets into private real estate and private equity for participants if you simply offer a standalone solution? To me, the answer is clear. You're not going to get significant exposure into participants' assets. That's for us yet another reason why this needs to get into the target date fund, because it's great to talk about how risk-adjusted returns are better on private equity and private real estate, and let's add a lineup item to it. The reality is you're not going to get many assets into it. So I think that's the other thing, Chris, around helping participants understand this. It's important, but also sometimes, and this is going to sound blunt, force feeding is the right way to go about things, right? We do auto enrollment, we do auto escalation these days. Getting private equity, private real estate into a DC plan, ultimately, in my view, is only going to happen through the target date fund, not through a standalone sleeve.
Yep, I would agree. I've seen some examples of whether it be a DB plan or others, you know, smaller segments of privates being offered on a standalone basis. And to your point, they tend to have very little take up. You know, some have been offered and then subsequently closed down just because of the lack of take up that you just mentioned. You know, Brad, I'll turn things back to you. Maybe thinking about the big picture. We've talked about some of the benefits. We've talked about a lot of risks. Was there, you know, one, or what were the key catalysts ultimately for Lockheed to get comfortable with incorporating alternatives in the DC plan?
Well, a lot of it, you know, we wanted to show some evidence that through this process we had, you know, provided some innovation and modernization of the plan. I do agree at the end with what Marco says. At the end of the day, I think it only belonged in the TDF, and it kind of did have to be forced fed a bit. On the communications aspect, the investment team did the first stab on the communications, the frequently asked questions, and we all like wrote a book for all these things. And then our GC, who's an artist that paints in red, just sliced into it and said, let us. And unfortunately, the party on our team that had to digest, serve as the interpreter and to produce something digestible for our participants out of what came out of the mouths of the investment team was once again team legal. And so that's kind of who took on that burden. But I think it just reminds you how important ultimately the communications are, and what we're trying to get through was we're getting the participants access to something they normally would not have and could not get themselves, and that this is going to be a great enhancement to returns without taking more risk.
Great, thanks, Brad. And I'll stay with you for a minute. You've talked about the utilization within a target date fund. Can you provide any color on the sizing and how you're expecting that to impact those risk-adjusted returns ultimately for participants?
Well, we've seen great results on the take up. Time will tell on the improvement of the returns. From what we've seen so far is about half of the capital that was allocated into the options that went away, that were sort of underutilized. Half of those assets went into the target date and stayed there. And so that turned out to be rather material, actually. So we're certainly getting, we're achieving our objectives there. Too soon to tell on the performance.
Yep. Thank you.
It has to be better, because like as Marco was saying, we continue to have better DB plan performance on the private side. It's actually kind of through the roof. So this has got to work over the long term on the DC side.
Yeah, I think there's been a lot of surveys, and we've done some at AllianceBernstein of participants that have told us they want it done for them, in terms of the point you're all making of utilizing it and leveraging the QDIA or a balance fund. And I think participants are ultimately voting with their dollars as well when you do things such as a re-enrollment. We've talked about Dan and Brad, they're utilizing DC friendly, daily valued and daily liquid solutions. Another way that we've talked about is implementing the alternatives that are utilized in a DB plan. Maybe it's just the private equity or the private real estate, for example. Maybe it's the unitization of the whole defined benefit plan and utilizing that. That's actually a question that came in from the audience. What I've seen mostly to date has been the utilization or the unitization, of the entire defined benefit plan, which includes both publics and privates, rather than just one small or narrow segment. But Marco, maybe I'll come back to you. Are there any other considerations as you think about providing DC plan participants access to the DB plan?
I mean, to your point, Chris, right? Unitization is not new. There's a number of state plans. VRS, Virginia, for example, offers what you mentioned, right? A unitized DB plan, and they have actually done a nice way of actually delivering liquidity to participants, while the DB plan, they can buy it only on a quarterly basis, but it's parked temporarily in the target date fund. What we want to do is be a little bit more surgical, if you will, and really unitize individual asset classes. So private equity, private real estate, and partially that's driven by the reason that we want to incorporate it in the target date fund. And our asset allocation across the glide path is not static. So if we were to unitize the entire, call it alternatives book, we wouldn't be able to actually incorporate the changes of asset allocation over time in our glide path. So the idea for us is to keep the glide path as it is, keep our private equity, our equity exposure as it is from an allocation perspective, but mix in private equity. So what we will do, or we want to do, is actually unitize just an asset class and not an overarching alternatives portfolio, or even broader, the entire DB plan. So we really want to use this in a more nuanced fashion.
Great, thanks. Yeah, there's some trade-offs between being able to be a little bit more specific in the asset allocation versus, some the ease or the simplicity of unitizing what is existing today, which is the entire defined benefit plan. We've only got about 5 minutes left, so maybe Dan, I'll turn back first to you. And if you had any key takeaways you wanted to share with the audience that you haven't mentioned today, we'd love to hear them. And also, could you share, the direction of travel for Utah in terms of, you've incorporated private real estate in the DC plan today. What, if anything, are you thinking about in the future as it relates to alternatives?
Certainly. We're looking at other alternatives, private equity as well. We've also had many conversations about unitizing as well, just to kind of see how that would work. Haven't really gotten any firm conclusions on that as of today, but we are definitely looking at it and just trying to figure out what ultimately is best, given our constraints that we have and our size and all the other variables that are associated with that. I will say, though, that part of the reason for even looking into that, just as we're kind of looking forward into the space of private real estate, it did feel in the early 2010s when we were looking at this, that a lot of the options that were available to us just happened to be managers saying, hey, we've got a large open-end commingled fund. Let's provide some sort of an option so that defined contribution dollars can be invested in this, which is great. That was probably needed. But it didn't really feel like it was specifically designed for what that these dollars were intended for. And it also just feels like right now the defined contribution dollars, at least in the public or the plan sponsor realm, is small, but it's going to get very, very large. And I guess that's kind of the thing that I'm trying to think about, is that overused analogy of skate to where the puck is going, not where it is. I'm just trying to think of the evolution of this space, the evolution of products that'll be available, managers, and options. Right now it's good. You can put dollars into these large commingled funds, but if I look at what I do on the defined benefit side, we don't just put all of our dollars into one manager and just call it good. So that's one thing that I think we would like to look at is maybe a little bit more options and a little bit more creativity as to very specific strategies we might want to put those defined contribution dollars into.
Great, thanks, Dan. Brad, I'll turn to you. Any other key takeaways, and you talked a little bit about the direction of travel at Lockheed, but anything else that you'd like to share? Well,
we're still. I feel like we're in the very early days of real innovation here. So we're it's interesting. Our next step obviously is going to be NPE. And then, so we're watching the DOL and we're watching the GPs, and it's as Dan said, it's about the products, and we're seeing rapid evolution there. And so I think, you watch the regulatories, you watch who's going to invent a better mousetrap to this thing, and we'll kind of go from there. But that's what we're doing, monitoring.
Great. Thanks, Brad. And Marco, any last words from you? You talked about the process on private equity that you'll be undertaking, and any other comments you'd like to share?
I think ultimately it's going to take a village to actually get broad adoption. So I think one of the things that is going to be important, we talked about fees, regulatory challenges. Obviously, all of the sponsors today are doing a great job. Anything we can do jointly as plan sponsors, as GPs, as consultants to actually drive the narrative of why this is important and get that voice collectively and combined out there is going to be really important. So the work that you all are doing is tremendously important. I think we need to do more, right? So to gain broad acceptance, and it can't just be the GPs out there talking or the consultants. It needs to be a concerted effort. And I think that would be my final parting words of wisdom is we all need to ultimately drive that narrative and message to ultimately about improve outcomes for our participants, because that is at the end of the day why we're talking about all this. And tying this all back together and not forgetting about, this is not about private equity and unitization and GPs. This is about improving outcomes. And I think if we go back to the basics, this is going to end up working.
Great. Thanks, Marco. And I'd like to echo what you just said. It takes a village, and there was a village that was responsible for putting this all together. Again, DCREC, DCALTA, DCIIA, and PREA. But I'd really like to thank the three of you, Brad, Dan, and Marco, for your time today, for sharing your insights. But I'd say most importantly, I'd like to thank each one of you for the work that you do on behalf of the participants in your plan. So thank you for joining today. It's been a great panel, and look forward to seeing everyone soon.